almost want to ask you about the Middle East, because it is one of those big things when we wrapped up the trading year about a year ago, that when we talk about risks to the world, the investment environment, geopolitics came up. Before we get into the East Coast strike, I would love for you to weigh in on what is happening in the Middle East, and if at all you see any impact or concerns about maybe the outlook of your world.
Good afternoon, Carol and Tim, and you're exactly right. There are a lot of geopolitical influences on supply chain decision makers and have been for some time. Looking at the Middle East today, cargo ships are still rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, avoiding the Red Sea with the Houthi rebels. Suez Canal receipts are down 80 to 90%, and there's no less than 4 ongoing conflicts. This causes great concern for the certainty of the supply chain and how you have to do reroutes and workarounds to keep commerce flowing. But our thoughts and minds and hearts are with the people on the ground. So and making sure families are safe.
So layer on top of that then, the strike that we're now seeing on the East Coast ports, obviously not ideal for many, many different reasons. Are you seeing, first of all, increased traffic on the West Coast ports, your port in particular, because of what's happening here on the East Coast?
Yes, Carol, we started to see an uptick in cargo volume at the beginning of the year. People were a little bit concerned not only about a protracted dockworkers negotiation, but drought conditions in the Panama Canal, in addition to those security concerns in the Red Sea. Our cargo volume is up 17% year to date, and we've had a very long peak season that began in June and still continues with some steam here now going into October. In fact, our third quarter ending yesterday is our best on record in 116 years.
Do you see that continuing into the fourth quarter, which starts today?
Typically, the month of October is met with the Golden Week holiday in China, formerly called National Day. We've got enough cargo still there at the major ports in China to profile our vessels next week. October will be strong. Then we might see a tapering off a little bit of the cargo volume, and that's seasonal, no more, no less. We're only in day one of this dockworkers strike on the East Coast. No impacts on the ground that we see today, but the next 48, 72 hours will be crucial.
How do you expect, Gene, dock workers on the West Coast, in West Coast ports, to stand in solidarity with their counterparts on the East Coast? Will they refuse to unload freight diverted from East Coast ports?
We have not had any ships that are designated for East or Gulf Coast ports make a left-hand turn and come into Los Angeles. And we're watching that very closely because my experience says that that is sacrosanct between these two working unions. One will not take advantage of another's bargaining position and move ships around. What you have seen are cargo owners that try to hedge against occurrences like this and maybe put a little bit more of their allocation towards West Coast ports, including Los Angeles and Long Beach, that otherwise would have gone to the East Coast. And we also saw that last year as our negotiations with the dock workers here with the ILWU went a little bit longer than some experts expected. And we saw some of our discretionary cargo, that which goes to the middle part of the country, move to those eastern ports.
Yeah, I will point out that estimates from the National Association of Manufacturers show that the strike jeopardizes $2.1 billion in trade daily, and the total economic damage could reduce GDP by as much as $5 billion a day. So that's one statistic, I should say, that we are certainly reporting out. Gene, having said that, I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of folks maybe listening who have no idea what a dock worker makes, what a dock worker gets in terms of benefits, what a dock worker is probably fighting for. What can you tell us about that front?
These are well-paid six-figure jobs, but it's a skill set that's shared by few. The training and education that goes into these folks' curricula that to manage these big pieces of industrial equipment to move off all this cargo, very few and far between in the American workforce. These jobs are good for the middle class. In some cases, they're generational. Port cities like ours here in Los Angeles, around the enclaves of San Pedro and Wilmington, are built around these dock workers and families for generations. The economic landscape globally and in our shipping industry has changed dramatically since COVID. The last time that this dockworkers group, the ILA, negotiated was back in 2019, before all these changes took place. The union is saying they need to keep up with the growing economic influence of the shipping lines and the profits that they've earned.
Gene, as Carol mentioned, you dealt with prolonged negotiations and delays and slowdowns in the movements of goods along the West Coast ports that finally resulted in a new contract. That was about a year ago. Given that, what would your advice be to your counterparts at East Coast ports who are going through the strike right now?
Yeah, a good question, Tim. Just keep everybody moving forward. There's a lot that's always said during negotiations. You know, blood pressure goes up, folks get a little bit hot under the collar, but keep people at the table negotiating on these salient points. In this case, it's wage, automation or robotics, and the other work rules that are necessary. If we're apart, nothing gets done. If you're at the table, we can start chipping away at these issues. And the ports are typically seen as the convener. And I know that the White House is working diligently across several agencies to make sure these talks continue with shuttle diplomacy and just keeping chipping away at these issues. But as that natural convener and the good negotiators that they are, these ports can play a pivotal role in getting to a conclusion.
What's the smart conversation, though, around automation? Our Bloomberg technology team, I was listening to them earlier talk about the subject, and you just have the natural progression of technology taking over tasks that we all used to do by hand, or that you needed a human to do it. We know that just continues, especially in the past year and a half. We talked so much about generative AI, so many different things that are changing our world that now have been taken over by technology. So what is the smart conversation around that when you've got businesses that are potentially publicly held companies that are thinking about costs, and automation perhaps saves on that aspect? What's the responsibility of companies versus, towards their shareholders versus perhaps their workers?
Great question, Carolyn. It's the most polarizing conversation in our industry, but two thoughts. One, our belief here in Los Angeles is that technology is never moving faster than it is today, but we cannot leave the worker behind. And secondly, when it comes to the automation negotiation between private sector interests and unionized labor, there are very few examples. Only 5% of the 360 ports around the world that are observed have some semblance of automation or robotics. 5%. We're a little heavier here in Southern California, and honestly have seen mixed results. But there are examples where if we could peel back everything else, automation can create additional capacity at that marine terminal and port. We can also take a workforce and not have to just chop it down by 80%, as we've seen in some cases. If we can keep that workforce stable, double or even go beyond 2x capacity at these marine terminals, there may be a formula here that helps both sides tremendously. Now, we'll get into the time and duration of return on investment. We'll look at the types of skills that are needed, whether it needs to be upskilled and reskilled for folks who have been around for a while, or getting the technology training in place for the next generation of worker. In my experience, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. There's a skillful way to do this, and that's where I would be right now in these negotiations.
All right, we are talking with Gene Seroka, Executive Director of the Port of Los Angeles. I'm Carol Massar, along with Tim Stenovec here live on Bloomberg Business Week. Do want to mention a headline crossing. The Israel police updating the number of dead in that Tel Aviv attack to 6. So we continue to get some headlines following the launch of missiles, ballistic missiles by Iran. But there was also another direct attack in the area in Tel Aviv. So we're starting to get some more details about some of the casualties in that. And
that one is shooting.
Yeah, that was
earlier.
a shooting. Yeah.
Gene, I want to go back to Gene Seroka joining us from Los Angeles. Gene, economists are still trying to figure out how much damage to a supply chain this would do, what the economic cost would be. Estimates range from $1 billion to $5 billion a day in delayed or lost activity as a result of this strike, as a result of these strikes. Given your perch, given where you are, I'm wondering how long you think this strike will go on.
Yeah, Tim, that's an estimate of the average amount of cargo value that goes through these ports on a daily basis. Not all of it is perishable in the most clear sense. If this strike is very short, couple, 3 days, there's the ability to catch up on getting this commerce out to the interior of the country, to the consumer bases across the eastern seaboard very quickly. It's when it becomes a lot longer than just these several days that if it turns into weeks, we'll have a very different discussion right here on this show. The other piece to this is that this strike will impact someone somewhere, guaranteed. So whether it truly is a fruit or vegetable that's coming up from Central America, or it's a specific product that has to be sold by a particular date, that may go away forever. And it's the stock out for the retailer. It's the order that an individual put in that may not make it in time for their consumer. That's what goes away as well. But it's just not a flat number of $5 billion a day that will be eliminated from the United States economy if we can get these sides to reach agreement in a decent amount of time. And I would say that putting up pickets across 14 major ports will motivate some more than ever to get to the table.
So I want to just go back to wages and just got 30 seconds here. My understanding is the most recent offer from the United States Maritime Alliance was for a 50% wage increase. The workers wanted, I think, more like 68%, but forgive me if I've got that number wrong. It sounds like a lot, and I think if somebody hears that, it sounds like a lot. In just 30 seconds, is it that their pay was so low, or is that a pretty aggressive request? And just quickly, if you could.
I think the pay was a little bit low in keeping up with the gigantic income level jumps that you've seen in the shipping industry. This is an affordable quotient, but there are details that have to be resolved.